Louisiana, home to one of the densest swampland in the United States. Lurking within the bog lies the most feared secret in all of Louisiana, the Honey Island swamp monster. It's said to be one of the most feared creatures in all Louisiana, and some people say it's even more terrifying than Bigfoot. A lot of people have claimed to see this creature, but is there any truth to the legend, or is it just a myth? In this video, I'm going to be taking a closer look at this creature and see if there's any truth to the legends. For most of us, our childhood unfolds in neighborhoods surrounded by other children. Some of these settings are rural, others urban. Either way, most of us had friends with whom we could make our own adventures. Rarely did actual adventure encroach into our lives. This was not the case, though, for Dana, who grew up along the Pearl River deep in the heart of Louisiana's Honey Island swamp, one of America's most pristine wetlands. Her family home was isolated from civilization in a way few of us can really comprehend. She had spent her youth in and on the water where it seemed anything could happen. The Southern Gothic tableau of Saint Tammany Parish provided a backdrop for Dana's adolescence. Massive cypress trees stretching over the bayou, Spanish moss clinging to their limbs like curtains obscuring manifold mysteries. In this setting, Dana was in constant contact with the diverse flora and fauna of the swamp. It became almost routine to have run-ins with bears, alligators, and raccoons. According to Dana's grandfather, Harlan Ford, something far more sinister prowled the 70,000 acres of swampland. When she was just 10 years old, Harlan told his granddaughter, "I don't rightly care what anyone else thinks. I know what I saw, and you better be careful where you go back out there." That's no joke, kiddo. Harlan Ford was referring to a series of events that began in 1963. Harlan, who had retired from his career as an air traffic controller, spent his remaining years as an avid hunter and amateur aviator. This skill allowed him to scout the most remote reaches of Honey Island Swamp, those hidden hunting grounds which enticed him the most. That summer, Harlan spotted the perfect campsite from the air. It was where the west and east branches of the Pearl River met, a treacherous region where few other hunters dare to tread. If they could manage to establish a foothold there, he and his friend Billy D. Mills Sr. would find little interference from competing hunters. They'd have the run of the place. Using the heading obtained while flying, Harlan and Bill began the arduous task of bushwhacking through the swamp and navigating around the countless lakes and bayous standing in their way. They soon discovered that if they docked their boats as two strategic points, the majority of the path to the hunting ground would be accessible on foot. After establishing their route, the two hunters began moving supplies out to the campsite between the rivers in early August of 1963. And that was when they first encountered the Honey Island swamp monster. Harlan and Bill were hustling through the forest that day, hauling a heavy outboard motor to their destination as quickly as possible. When they rounded a bend and noticed the hindquarters of an animal standing on four legs in the trail, it was about 20 yards ahead of them, busying itself in the bushes. At first, they thought it was a wild hog, but as they watched, they realized it was different. As seasoned outdoorsmen, they knew all the animals native to the swamp, but the pair could not figure out just what was blocking their path. "What the hell is that thing?" Bill had asked. As the sound of his voice, the shaggy shape whirled about to face the men. It was covered with short, dingy gray fur, with longer hair on its head that almost reached the ground. Its bottom half was thin and lean, while its upper half, including the chest and shoulders, were massive. Atop this frame sat a square, human-like head, which glared at the pair of intruders. The creature shifted from all fours to stand upright on two legs, stretching over 7 feet tall. From the looks of it, it had to weigh at least 400 pounds. This massive figure then bolted from the trail over a mound of earth and into the briars and bushes, leaving Bill and Harlan absolutely stunned. The men dropped their gear and tried to flank the creature, readying their rifles for a shot. But the opportunity never materialized. It was as if they had seen a ghost. A subsequent search of the area failed to reveal any tracks or den. This was the first of dozens of encounters that Harlan would claim. From that point forward, he and his friends would catch fleeting glimpses of the Honey Island swamp monster or hear its cries echoing across the bayou. These occurred most often at dusk or in the dead of night, and seemed confined to a relatively small area of the swamp. Seasoned hunting dogs, never afraid to corner a black bear, would return to their owners, whining frantically, tails tucked between their legs. Some sightings would be accompanied by a suffocating stench. While it often seemed to avoid people, there was always the sense that the creature could be highly dangerous if provoked, or if it felt it had any advantage. Mostly, though, the Honey Island swamp monster just seemed curious. Harlan related the encounter of one friend who, while gathering firewood on a camping trip, glanced up to find a tall, dark, immense form on two legs watching him nearby. It bobbed its head from side to side as it stared, and the friend grabbed his gun but could not bring himself to fire at the thing. It simply looked too much like a human being. Instead, he shouted at the apparition, which melted and melded into the darkness of the forest. In the winter of 1963, Harlan and fellow duck hunters were shuffling through the underbrush and fallen leaves when they stumbled across a wild hog carcass by the lake. It looked as if it had been there for several days. The animal was roughly about 60 feet from the shoreline, its throat torn and its body covered in deep gouges. Just a short distance later, they found a second hog body, identically maimed. Though bewildered, the hunters refused to let this spoil their day, and Harlan continued his search for ducks. Now, 50 yards further along the lake, he noticed water rippling in the shade of a massive oak tree. The hunters, hoping it was a duck feeding on fallen acorns, approached the area on their hands and knees. It wasn't a duck. It was a third hog. And although it did display the same injuries, it was still barely clinging to life. It lay there on the shore, its hind legs kicking the water as it bled out, and a 10-foot radius of blood splatter coated the surrounding vegetation, telltale signs of a recent struggle. Harlan later reflected on this experience, wondering what kind of creature would do just this for the pleasure of killing, leaving its prey lying in the woods. He and the other hunters left as quickly as they could. The entire affair cast an experience from the prior autumn in a new, terrifying light. Harlan and Bill had been out squirrel hunting when they heard something that sounded like beating a drum. At the same time, they could hear a hog squealing for dear life. Both men thought that it had to be something big beating on that hog like that. On another occasion, Harlan and 6 friends, including Bill, had set off in 2 boats to fish the West Pearl River. When they tried to return home, however, Bill's engine started to run hot, forcing Harlan to shuffle their party back up the river in pairs, dropping them off at camp. On his first return trip downstream, Harlan's headlamp revealed the creature standing brazenly in the swift-flowing river. The amount of snags and debris in the water kept forcing Harlan to look away, but each time he looked back, the creature was where he had left it. He wanted to take a shot, but that seemed like a bad idea, given the distance, the darkness, and the treacherous water. Harlan reached the stranded fishermen and told them what he had seen. One of them, a skeptic by the name of Jim Hartzog, yelled, "Let me have that gun of yours and I'll go back up there and shoot that big booger for you boys." Harlan obliged, tossing him a flashlight, his .870 Magnum, and 3 shells. Jim went off on his crusade while Harlan ferried the remaining men to camp. Then they had barely started upstream when all the men heard a deep howl, and the sound of the firearm discharging twice in the forest. They looked to the riverbank where they saw Jim waving and shouting frantically. They rescued him right away. Harlan was eventually featured on the 1970s television program In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy. On the program, he shared what he learned from Jim. One evening, late, just about dusk to dark, a friend of mine encountered eyes. They were a yellow or amberish color and real wide apart, so Jim took a gun, went into the area to try and take out whatever it was, and he says that he came face to face with this thing. It looked something like an ape, about 7 foot tall, and he fired on it while using a headlight. He said when he did, the eyes went out. Harlan felt there was nothing supernatural to this, rather that the creature had simply turned and fled. He added that Jim shot at it one more time. We went back the next day and checked for any blood, but we didn't find anything. So we figured Jim missed it that night. Now the next spring, Harlan's son-in-law and another friend had gone out turkey hunting near the lake where they had found the hogs massacred. According to Harlan, around sundown, the two men heard a wild turkey fly up to roost for the night. Instead of trying to bag it in the darkness, they decided to return to their lakeside camp, planning instead to come back to their turkey roost just before dawn. The entire trip back, however, they could hear heavy footfalls following them. Eventually, something inhuman called out from across the lake. The turkey was lucky. Both hunters abandoned their plan, instead moving their efforts to the safety of the opposite riverbank the following morning. Harlan's son, Perry, and his wife were camping in Honey Island Swamp when they too heard a hideous cry echoing across the lake. At first, Perry simply gripped his gun and told his wife it was nothing to worry about. When the sounds got too close for comfort, however, he began building a fire as quickly as he could. No sooner had the flames roared to life than the creature began circling the camp. From just beyond the fire's protective glow, they could hear it snarling, crying, even breathing. It came so close. And Perry was born and bred in the swamp, and he had never heard anything like it in all of his years. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and Harlan Ford made his first cast of the Honey Island Swamp Monster tracks in October of 1974. A detour had led him to a new portion of the area that he had never visited, and within the maze of bayous, he discovered a trackway leading to a watering hole. Luckily, Harlan, now more or less an amateur cryptozoologist at this point, had plaster of Paris on hand and had the foresight to go work. After they had set, what they revealed was remarkable. Some of the footprints were over 10 inches long, smaller than most Bigfoot tracks. While the heels and arches were recognizable as those of a primate, the feet ended in toes and claws, which seemed almost reptilian. What's more is there were only 4 toes, connected by some sort of webbing. Suffice to say, this contrasted starkly with the human-like prints cast around the same time frame in the Pacific Northwest. Whatever haunted Honey Island Swamp wasn't quite Bigfoot. It was different. Harlan Ford continued to gather evidence supporting the Honey Island Swamp Monster's existence until his very death in 1980. After he passed away, his wife Yvonne discovered a treasure trove of evidence in a box in his attic. Plaster cast, a formal letter explaining his experiences, and a now infamous grainy 8mm film. It was nested alongside other reels with labels like turkey, deer, or even gator. This one read Honey Island Swamp Monster. The film shows Harlan traveling upriver by boat before climbing a tree to film from a blind. As the camera surveys the forest edge, a figure comes into focus. Large and walking on 2 legs, apparently covered in fur as it stalks through the swamp, and then disappears into the trees. Despite his appearance on television, Harlan was actually quite private about his experiences with the monster, mostly sharing them among family and friends. If he had fabricated the entire thing for fame or for hunting rights, Why had he sat upon such compelling evidence? Harlan wasn't a man to make up something like that, Dana Holyfield said years after his death. He was down to earth and honest and told it the way it was and didn't care if people believed him or not. Dana thinks that her grandfather never released the film for 2 reasons. Number 1, he had seen the ridicule people heaped upon him for his sightings. And 2, he may have feared for the safety of others. Someone trying to be brave and to kill the monster might injure themselves or another human being in the process. Or, should their shot miss, the being might attack them. The stories and evidence that her grandfather produced left a lasting impact on Dana. To this day, she has written more on the Honey Island swamp monster than anyone else, a self-proclaimed swamptologist and monsterologist who regularly releases books not only on the creature but the beloved bayou in which she was raised. It would be easy to dismiss the Honey Island swamp monster as one of these fictions passed down within a family. However, people outside of Harlan Ford's bloodline have found themselves facing down large, hairy creatures in the swamp as well. While Harlan Ford may have logged the first official sighting of the Honey Island swamp monster, stories had circulated throughout the region for years. Dana Holyfield has collected dozens of such encounters. One of the more famous witnesses was trapper and fisherman Ted Williams, who was also featured alongside Harlan on In Search Of, and he told filmmakers that, "First time I ever saw it, it was standing plumb still like a stump. I stopped and realized it wasn't a stump and it wasn't supposed to be there. When I stopped, it ran. It was dark gray. About 7 foot high, it jumped a bayou, and that was the first time I saw it. The next time I seen him was swimming in the river, the Pearl River. 2 of them. One was bigger than the other and faster than the other, and they swam just like humans with them long overhead strokes. I tried to get one of them to look at me, and the other one ran off and the other one would not look at me. I could have shot it, but I wouldn't on account it wouldn't look at me. It looked too much like a human to me. Broad shoulders, arms hanging down below the knees, hands looking almost like a human." Ted would claim numerous sightings of the creature over his lifetime, often as they crossed the river. On one occasion, he claimed his boat was so close that he felt water hit him as the creatures shook their coats dry. It's worth noting that Ted first mistook the Honey Island swamp monster for a stump. This is reported time and time again in Bigfoot sightings. Apparently, the creatures can stand so still that they are often misidentified as stumps, not only in blurry photographs, but in eyewitness accounts as well. Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner discuss numerous examples of this behavior in their 2-part book series, Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. Returning to Ted, a few years after his television debut, he disappeared into the swamp. The only thing recovered was his boat. In recent years, this claim has come under doubt, but is no less mysterious. Ted's granddaughter told Dana that she thinks they did find his body, but she didn't know how he had perished. This is not the first death or disappearance associated with the creature, because in 2017, the descendant of a Pearl River resident wrote Dana Holyfield telling her that his great-grandfather once found the monster sleeping in a den in an isolated corner of the swamp. Deciding he should kill the beast, he came home to fetch more ammunition before returning back to its lair. He was never seen again. When the great-grandson revealed the victim's name, Dana recognized it immediately. Rumors had circulated all throughout the swamp for generations about the man's mysterious disappearance. Accounts like the one told by Ted Williams suggest a breeding population of creatures rather than a sole long-lived specimen. Now, this possibility was corroborated by Fred Lemon, who saw several of the monsters while at his buddy's camp with a girlfriend. Lemon said the location was in the farthest reaches of the swamp. A heavy rain had just set in. Without warning, a hairy fist shot through the glass window of their camper. I looked out the window and could see a bunch of them roaming around there in the rain, Fred had told Dana. So I threw open the door and fired my shotgun at them and they scattered. A sleepless night ensued. Fred and the woman left at first light, swearing off Honey Island Swamp entirely. Neil Benson, who runs Pearl River Echo Tours today, remains adamant that he too saw something strange in Honey Island Swamp during his younger days. I was 16 years old, paddling away from duck blind in a pirogue, he said. I saw something tall, moving unlike any creature I have ever seen move on two legs through the water unimpeded. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't like any man I've seen. To this day, he is at a loss for what it was. Tours like the one Neil Benson operates are commonplace in Honey Island Swamp. Visitors are often afforded a glimpse of the wetland's untouched beauty, including the abundance of wildlife found within. Although rare, visitors sometimes see more than they bargained for on these excursions. A woman named Terry had contacted Dana Hollyfield in the fall of 2010. Terry explained how she and her stepson and her father took a swamp tour on November 9th, just 3 days prior. As she surveyed the shoreline from the tour boat, Terry spotted something horrendous. It was a figure, gazing back at her from the trees with enormous, sickly eyes. The eyes were tinted yellow as if diseased and set within a face whose skin looked old, worn leather. The head sat atop a 7-foot-tall body covered in grayish-black hair. The sight left Terry absolutely petrified. She did not speak a word to any of the tourists. No one, including her stepson and father, seemed to have seen the thing, although several other people did mention a foul, filthy smell which made them gag, something the tour guide dismissed as an animal carcass somewhere hidden along the riverbank. She concluded her message to Dana by saying, "What was supposed to be a very relaxing afternoon with my family turned into the most terrifying day of my life." Honey Island Swamp resident Denty Crawford knows this fear all too well. He was driving his 3-wheeler one day when he spotted a large animal running up a levee. Initially, believing it was a bear, Denty stopped his vehicle, grabs his rifle, and set off in pursuit. As he drew nearer, he began hearing the sound of lips smacking. Eventually, Denty spotted it through a break in the foliage. A creature with man-like shoulders covered with hair. But its back was more flat than rounded like a bear, he said. The thing was enjoying a meal of bugs pulled from beneath the bark of a nearby tree trunk. Denty slowly backed away, unsure whether or not a single shot could take down something so massive. He refused to go back to that part of the swamp again. Time and time again, we hear witnesses vowing to never return to the site of their encounters. Such was the case for Jerry Ross, who reluctantly shared his story with Dana Hollyfield. After his camper's generator died unexpectedly, Jerry looked out the window to see what was the matter. Looking back at him was a 7-foot-tall silhouette covered in dark hair and sporting a pair of red eyes. Jerry backed away from the window. He grabbed an extension cord to tie the camper door shut. At last, he dared to look back outside. The red eyes were now closer than ever, peering in on him. "I shot a flare out the window," he said, "and the next thing I know, it's up in the trees looking down with red eyes. It didn't try to hurt me, but it stayed there most of the night. When daylight came, I left and I did not go back up to my camp for 2 years." In 1981, a friend named Hubert told journalist Jerry Breaux that he encountered the monster one warm morning while hunting. He was perched in an oak tree looking for deer when heavy footfalls began approaching from behind. Hubert froze as an 8-foot-tall, hairy biped strode into his field of view. It ignored him and silently passed back into the trees. According to Breaux, Hubert was visibly distressed when retelling his sighting. His breathing elevated, his jaw clenched. In the autumn of that same year, 2 young boys, so close they considered each other family, were hunting in the Honey Island Swamp. As they neared the river that misty morning, they heard a massive splash. Moments later, they saw the hairy back of a dark, muscular creature emerging from the water, rising until it stood 6 or 7 feet tall. It effortlessly dislodged a cypress stump and tossed it into the river. Fear paralyzed both boys as the beast turned to look at them. Its face was hairless around the nose and mouth. Without making a sound, the creature took off at a brisk pace, following the river's edge. When they mustered the courage to investigate the area, the boys found, in a departure from Harlan Ford's cast, a set of classic human-shaped Bigfoot tracks. The Pearl River forms the boundary between Louisiana and Mississippi. While most sightings of the Honey Island swamp monster come from the western side, encounters east of the river have occurred as well. In fall of 1997, a girl and her mother, Picayune, Pearl River County, decided to take their pet Doberman for a walk through the Mississippi side of the swamp at an exit off Interstate 59. It was just before 1 p.m. in the afternoon. After around 10 minutes, the daughter realized that she had left something in the car. She briefly left the dog and her mother on the road through the swamp, and when she returned, her mother seemed transfixed. She was staring at something deeper in the woods, and she pointed out to her daughter, who could vaguely make out an indistinct grayish-black shape around 75 feet away. Judging from the way the sunlight was hitting it, it filtered through the canopy. It was not a tree trunk. The texture was entirely different, more like hair than anything else, really. It also seemed large, well over 6 feet tall. Whatever it was, the figure was kind of swaying back and forth, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. Both women became uncomfortable after watching for a few minutes and agreed they should relocate right now. They returned to the car with their dog, drove at least a mile up the road, and resumed their walk. Any sense of safety vanished within moments. The sound of bipedal footsteps began approaching from within the swamp, drawing nearer with each step. The dog, while not frightened, clearly displayed an interest in whatever was approaching. Once again, they returned to the car, drove further up the road another 1.5 to 2 miles, and unloaded once again, this time near some nature trails and a firing range. Within 2 minutes, the sounds were with them yet again, and this time, they had picked up the pace. Whatever it was now running towards them, thrashing through the trees on 2 feet. The dogs bolted for the car, smashing into the door. Its owners were close behind. They all piled into the vehicle, leaving for good. Now, about 3 hours later, they returned to the location of their initial sighting, hoping to see if they could determine what they had seen. Maybe they had been spooked by a rotten tree trunk. Yet, where the figure in the woods had once stood, there was nothing but open forest. Whatever it had been, it had moved in the meantime, perhaps following them as they relocated. Another Mississippi sighting occurred in an adjacent county further south along the Pearl River in 1975. As recounted by the witness over a dozen years later, he had spotted something which simply should not exist while growing up in Pearlington. He was 6 years old at the time and had been sleeping soundly in his second-story bedroom when the family dog became agitated, barking furiously. The witness and his siblings all hopped out of the bed to take a look outside. Now, adjacent to the rear of their home, they clearly saw a large shape rummaging through the family's garden. The moonlight provided ample illumination for the figure, which was only about 30 or so feet below. It was squatting down, eating vegetables so loudly that they could actually hear it gnawing away. The intruder looked up, noticed them, and resumed its feast. While the witness could not accurately describe its size, he knew it was shaped like a human being, but larger and obviously covered in dark, shaggy brown hair. When it had looked at them, its eyes seemed to emit a glow. According to the story, the grandfather eventually emerged from the rear of the house, firing his shotgun into the air, and the creature stood up on 2 legs, running across the backyard towards the Pearl River with astonishing speed. The next morning, the garden was filled with oversized, bare human footprints and the remnants of the creature's late-night snack. The Honey Island swamp monster has long confused cryptozoologists. Could it be Louisiana's Bigfoot variation? While descriptions of the creature suggest this possibility, the footprints cast by Harlan Ford run contrary to all scientific expectation. The toes are the biggest problem. We would not expect 3 prominent toes with a 4th, smaller digit in a primate foot. Where's the 5th toe? The webbing between the toes is much more prominent than the vestigial webbing seen in most primates. What's more, the toes don't end in fingernails. They end in what appear to be reptilian claws or talons of sort. Granted, all these features could represent adaptations to the swamp's wetlands and waterways. At the same time, the appearance does leave ample room for skeptics to mount a compelling argument that the Honey Island swamp monster's footprints are actually misidentified alligator tracks. The bayous are swarming with gators, after all, and the slippery soil could easily elongate a set of their tracks to look more like those of a hominid. Alligator feet also leave impressions significantly smaller than your typical Bigfoot prints, a feature reflected in the small size of Harlan Ford's cast. But at the same time, officials from the Louisiana Wildlife and Fish Commission, as well as zoologists from Louisiana State University, were unable to positively identify what made Harlan Ford's cast. Surely they would have been able to recognize smeared alligator tracks, right? Whether or not the footprints are genuine, they have nonetheless birthed one of the most persistent origin stories for the Honey Island swamp monster. Legend holds that a circus train traveling near the Pearl River derailed sometime in the early 20th century. While most of the exotic animals that escaped perished in the swamp, chimpanzees thrived in the area. Now here's where the tale gets even sillier. The chimps successfully mated with the native alligators, birthing half-reptile, half-ape monstrosities in the form of the Honey Island swamp monster. If you believe this is possible, then our education system is broken. This is not the way hybridization works, folks. Species can only interbreed with closely related species, like horses and donkeys or lions and tigers. A mammal-reptile hybrid is genetically impossible. But at the same time, the inspiration for this urban legend is clear, stemming from the Honey Island swamp monster's affinity for water. Whereas most primates tend to avoid swimming at all costs, Louisiana's Bigfoot often seems unbothered when faced rivers, lakes, and bayous, as the story of Ted Williams indicate. This love of water is actually quite common in Bigfoot reports. In 1960, dock workers from Ketchikan, Alaska, described the grace with which Sasquatch swim. One of the witnesses actually wrote researcher John Green. The letter read this: "The witness glanced up to see a human-like figure standing in the water halfway between the shore and the boat, just standing and staring at him. It had arms like a man and a head. It was probably wet and looked grayish color all over the head and body. It had round eyes, not big, beady-like. When the boy unfroze, he screamed bloody murder and ran blindly over the tied-up boats, back up the ladder, and toward the shack, still yelling his head off. The men came running, some with lights, and about 30 of them saw this thing. They shone several lights on it as it dived under the water and swam away. They could see it under the water swimming like a frog, arms forward over its head, but not doing a crawl stroke. The legs kicked like a frog. Plenty of accounts feature Bigfoot swimming far from land. For instance, J. Robert Alley's book, Rain Coast Sasquatch, features numerous instances where Bigfoot have been reported by fishermen out at sea. In one example, from May 9, 1990, crewman Lindsay Babbitt saw a Bigfoot in the waves through his binoculars. It had long hair, enormous black eyes, and a flat face, ruling out a sea lion. Babbitt was familiar with stories of Sasquatch and knew without a doubt that he was watching one as it slowly slipped beneath the waves, never to be seen again. The sighting happened a full mile offshore. And in 1955, Mrs. Darwin Johnson was swimming in Indiana when a large furry hand with claws grabbed her leg underwater, leaving scratches on her knee. In 1967, a fisherman working the Nooksack River in Washington cast his net only to find a Sasquatch tangled up inside. Now, closer to Louisiana, an unbelievable story from 1970 finds two fishermen watching a skunk ape from their boat in the Gulf of Mexico. The nearest land was Placida, Florida, 29 miles away. Maps of waterways and maps of Bigfoot sightings in the U.S. do overlap a great deal, as do maps of rainfall. Even cryptozoologist Loren Coleman had noted the preponderance of sightings along the creek bottoms of rural America. Could there be something deeper behind this correspondence? Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner have pointed out how numerous myths and legends from Europe link wild men to bodies of water. Wild men and wild women often took up residence in lakes and ponds or even the ocean. One of the best-known accounts comes from the Chronicon Anglicanum, a 13th century English text. It reads this: "Men fishing in the sea caught a wild man in their nets. He was naked and was like a man in all his members, covered with hair and with a long, shaggy beard. He eagerly ate whatever was brought to him, but if it was raw, he pressed it between his hands until all the juice was expelled. He would not talk, even when tortured and hung up by his feet. Brought into church, he showed no signs of reverence or belief. He sought his bed at sunset and always remained there until sunrise. He was allowed to go into the sea, strongly guarded with 3 lines of nets, but he dived under the nets and came up again and again. Eventually, he came back on his own free will, but later on he escaped and was never seen again. These beliefs even extend to the New World. Some tribes assert that hairy cannibal giants reside in the palaces at the bottom of the sea. In fact, the wild men and wild women of these legends are often indistinguishable from what we would call mermaids today, if a bit hairier. This has led prominent cryptozoologists like Loren Coleman to categorize the Honey Island swamp monster as a subclass of mer-being. Coleman suspects it is part of a more aggressive freshwater land-oriented subclass. For Coleman, other examples of this mer-being subspecies include Canada's own Thetis, lake monster, and the lizard man of Bishopville, South Carolina. Alligator ape hybrids, mer-squatches, any attempts to tackle the Honey Island swamp monster from a scientific perspective lands cryptozoologists in laughable territory. A more worthwhile exploration of the creature and its footprints might be found in folklore. It's worth noting that numerous legends around the world describe hairy apes with bird feet, which the Honey Island swamp monster tracks equally resemble. For example, some, not all, but some tribes in America's Northwest describe creatures comparable to Bigfoot whose feet resemble those of large birds, being the French term for werewolf. These beliefs melded with similar stories already told among the area's tribes. Tales of wolfwalkers, half-human, half-animal creatures haunted the Chitimacha and Attakapaw tribes. Although few Honey Island swamp monster witnesses give the best canine features, the broad strokes of a tall, hairy humanoid prowling the Pearl River are certainly consistent. Other mysteries cling to the swamp like an early morning fog. Indigenous mounds and burial sites, some uncatalogued, dot the drier portions of the region. Tales of buried treasure abound. By the 1920s, the swamp's ominous reputation made it the perfect spot to conduct illegal activity. Moonshiners once operated heavily out of the Honey Island swamp area, and anyone who failed to heed their warnings about monsters, stories often fabricated by moonshiners to keep their stills a secret, might find themselves the victims of foul play. One newspaper account from 1926 named moonshiner Will Seals as one such casualty. Seals' whiskey proved too popular and too profitable for his competitors, so they set his house ablaze, fatally shooting him when he tried to escape. The act was never prosecuted, as the criminals simply faded into the refuge of the impenetrable bayou. Some monsters are human, it seems. The Honey Island Swamp Monster is just the latest in a long series of legends to arise in the swamps of Louisiana. But more importantly, what do you believe? Is this something that could actually exist and have kept hidden away in the depths of the swamps, avoiding all mankind, or is this just a compilation of hallucinations, overactive imaginations, and misidentifications? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And also, if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and smack that big ol' red subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys in the very next video.